Hello, everyone. Greetings from Boston. I am delighted to be with you at the South Asia Unbound workshop at King's College London to present ongoing research from my newest book project. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers, Dr. Berenice Guillot-Richard at King's College London and Dr. Elizabeth Leek at the University of Leeds for organizing this workshop, for inviting me to be part of it, and for their broader initiative, New International Histories of South Asia. My book project, Connected Partitions from South Asia to the World, is a study of entangled social, economic, and political histories of partitions in the South Asian subcontinent from the 1900s to the 1970s. By focusing on the stateless and their lives, I'm reconstructing the travel itinerary of territorial divisions from the borderlands of Bengal, Burma, to other parts of the world through the League of Nations and through the United Nations. Based on this ongoing book project, my title, the talk that I will give today through this video is titled Battlefields to Borderlands, the Rohingya People and Decolonization, 1940s to the 1950s. And bear with me for a few seconds as I share my slide. There it is. Great. This paper explores how the entanglements of the Second World War, decolonization, and partitions in the Bengal Delta transformed the lives of the Muslims of Arakan, or the Rohingya people, as we know them today, from imperial subjects to precarious citizens in liminal spaces between nation states to stateless people. During the Arakan campaign of the Second World War, British and Japanese forces used communal differences along the lines of religion, language, and race to serve their own ends. The promise of independence from British rule attracted the Buddhists to fight on the side of the Japanese, while the promise of regional autonomy in British Burma after the war drove the Muslims to fight on the side of the Allied forces. The exploitation and the resultant exacerbation of communal differences between the Muslims and the Buddhist populations in southeastern Bengal, northwestern Burma, in those borderlands, if you will, created one of the first refugee crises for the Muslim population in Arakan in the years immediately after the Second World War in that part of the world. Extreme violence engulfed the area as British India and British Burma inched towards formal decolonization in 1947 and 1948, respectively. The historiography of the Bengal Delta region is dominated by studies of the 1905 partition, the 1947 partition, and the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War, where the nature and character of religious violence studied is predominantly between Muslims and Hindus. The state-centric histories of South Asia and Southeast Asia do not fully account for the transnational circulation of people, ideas, goods, and knowledge that transpired through these lands and waters, as well as the choke points and the bottlenecks in that transnational circulation. The ongoing research by Sana Iyer on the 1937 partition of British Burma from British India, Debjani Bhattacharya's environmental and legal history of colonial Calcutta, Sunil Amrit's climatic history of the subcontinent through weather and water, and most recently Sivasundaram's history of indigenous resistance against forces of globalization and empire are moving the conversation forward about transnational histories of the region beyond the confines of the nation state and beyond the centers of political and economic power. Burma itself remains largely neglected in the historiography on 20th century Southeast Asia, unlike Vietnam, unlike Cambodia or Indonesia. More importantly, Arakan, or the present-day Rakhine state, has fallen through the cracks of area studies because of its own interstitial character between South Asia and Southeast Asia, creating divides between what Willem van Schendel has masterfully called geographies of knowing and geographies of ignorance. Sunil Amrit, Sujit Sivasundaram, and Lauren Benton, my understanding, have been showing the way in which we as scholars can transcend these divides by centering the seas, the bays, and the oceans. Following them, my goal in this project is to understand the lives of the Muslims of Northwestern Arakan, Southeastern Chittagong, through their circular migration, first disrupted by the 1937 partition of Burma and India, and then by the Second World War, and finally by formal decolonization and its many afterlives that continue till this day. Partitions have been studied by generations of scholars as singular cases with a capital P, whether the subject matter is the partition of Ireland, Palestine, India, Cyprus, or Yugoslavia. Global transnational comparative histories of partitions in the 20th century are wanting. Fortunately, the edited volume by Laura Robson and Ari Dubnov has already taken the first major step to understand the transnational character of partitions by examining the territorial separations in Ireland, Palestine, and India, as they do in that volume that you have on the slide. Partitions, forced displacement, and state-making go hand in hand. As a result, partition itself is a useful means to understand citizenship, refugees, and border control, all of which are encapsulated in the plight of the present-day Rohingya people. Scholars like David Ludden have invoked partitions, their ongoing character, to make sense of the statelessness and the genocide of the Rohingya. My own work contributes to this new body of scholarship in which I foreground the connected and unfinished nature of partitions and how the plight of the stateless people in Arakan and Chittagong can be better understood through the history of the many territorial divisions of the Bengal Delta. The historiography of the China-Burma-India theater of the Second World War is no longer as thin as it once was. Inaugurated by Chris Bailey and Tim Harper's Forgotten Wars and Forgotten Armies, there are several monographs produced in recent years that have drawn scholarly attention to the Second World War's social, cultural, technological, economic, and political afterlives in the CBI theater. My work engages with and contributes to this emergent scholarship, and I intend to do that through both this paper and the broader, the larger book project. So who are the Rohingyas? It's a question that the policy community has been asking since at least 2017, if not earlier. Coastal southeastern Bengal and northwestern Arakan shared a common cosmopolitan cultural heritage with intertwined social, cultural, and economic lives. Integral to the maritime Silk Road, Arakan, or present-day Rakhine state, played host to Arab traders since the 9th century AD. Both due to new arrivals, due to trade and conversion of locals to Islam, a sizable Muslim population grew in that region, centering around the largest port, Chittagong. The Buddhist kingdom of Mrao Kyu emerged in Arakan in the 15th century, concurrent to and rivaling with the Bengal Sultanate. While the Portuguese Empire and the Dutch East India Company consolidated their trading settlements in southeastern Bengal, northwestern Arakan in the 16th and 17th centuries. Arakan itself first came under territorial control of British East India Company after the first Anglo-Burmese War of 1824-1826. After 1857, the Sepoy Mutiny or the War of Independence, depends on which side you're on. After 1857, as British colonial administrators began to use religious differences to manage, surveil, and control local populations, they also began to encourage migration of poor Muslims from southeastern Bengal to work in the rice plantations of northwestern Arakan as a cheap workforce, thus further expanding, not creating, but further expanding the local Muslim population. Racialized understandings of loyalty to the empire influenced British colonial policy. Colonial administrators considered South Asian Muslims of Bengal more reliable and loyal than the Sino-Tibetan Buddhists of Arakan, and hence encouraged migration of the former in this region as a means to control and surveil the latter. By the Third Anglo-Burmese War of 1885, when Burma officially became part of British India, migration from the Bengal presidency to Arakan reached its height. So much so that in the 1920s and the 1930s, the large size of Bengali-speaking Muslim population threatened the majority Buddhist, Buddhist population in Arakan, leading to violent agitation against what the Buddhist population perceived to be a quote-unquote foreign Muslim population. And I just wanted to show this map so we can have a clear understanding that the part I'm talking about. On the slide to the right, there are two blue dots. Those are the two major townships where the Muslims of Arakan have been historically living, and that's also where they have been driven out from in the recent the last few years of conversation that we've been hearing about their genocide. One is Butidang and the other is Mongdo. During the Great Depression, racial tensions increased between prosperous Indians and Burmese laborers, leading to riots in Rangoon, which were overshadowed by anti-colonial peasant rebellion led by former Buddhist monk Saya San. Burmese anti-colonial nationalism in the 1930s therefore had a strong Buddhist undertone and a strong anti-Indian sentiment. To most of the Burmese population, the Indians, once again, Indians within quotes, the Indians were jointly benefiting with the British from Burma's colonial rule. The Indian in the Burmese imagination was a racial category and not a national category. And that racial category was an individual or group that was not Buddhist, that was not Burmese speaking, and certainly as a result was not indigenous to Burma, and therefore definitely always foreign. The 1937 partition of British Burma and British India created new borders between the two crown colonies. But the topography and the history of northeastern Arakan and southeastern Chittagong were such that circular migration of labor and commodities continued. I mean, if you just look at the map here once again, I mean, they're just separated by this river, the Naf River that's flowing. On the left is present-day Bangladesh, the district of Chittagong, and on the other side is the Rakhine state, or Arakan, as it was formerly known as, and that's the territory of Myanmar. The two nation states, they are separated by the Naf River, which was also the border drawn in 1937. And I think from the map, you can also get a sense of how fluid the topography is. It is a part of the largest delta in the world, and with a history of circular migration. and the history of sharing a very cosmopolitan heritage, a very cosmopolitan maritime heritage, which is also revealed by the boats that we have seen in many of the media reports, and by the boats you have, you also see in the slide. They're called moon boats in Bengali. They're called Chadnoko, which literally means moon boats. And I can get into those conversations about the boat and maritime heritage perhaps later in the paper when we'll have a chance to discuss that. So coming back to, once again, as I was talking about the 1930s, that even though the partition of British Burma established these borders of control and surveillance, and also led to expulsion of Indians from Burma because of racial tensions between the Burmese and the Indians. And Indians here, I emphasize the racial category, to the Burmese imagination, definitely. Now, moving away from the 30s and coming closer to the context of the Second World War, before I get into decolonization, during the Second World War, divided loyalties for the British Raj determined battlefield strategies of the Muslims and the Buddhists. A large number of Muslims who worked in the rice plantations of Akyab were recruited to fight as part of the V Force in the Arakan campaign of 1942-1943 on the side of the British against the Japanese. One of the bloodiest rounds of communal violence between pro-British Muslims and pro-Japanese Buddhists in Arakan transpired during the war. In 1942, as the Japanese armed the Arakanese Buddhists against the British and Allied forces, serious communal disorder supervened, according to a British War Office memo from that time period. In 1943, as the Muslim refugees returned back to their own villages, crossing the Naf River, supported by British troops, they faced retributive violence from the Buddhists. Under British law at the time, British subjects who were previously domiciled in Burma could not be prevented from entering there. However, the virulent nature of communal violence during the Second World War in 1943 particularly led British military administrators to mark Akyab as a protected area. And their goal was to temporarily stop the return of the Muslims back to their villages to prevent Muslim-Buddhist communal bloodshed. And these are maps on the slide that you see from the War Office, where you can see that the markings in red are positions of British troops, and the ones in blue are positions of Japanese troops. And if you look closely to the left, you can see that you can really tell. You can see Cox's Bazar that has been marked, which is where a lot of the refugee camps are today, and historically has been there. Like historically meaning after 47, after formal decolonization of British India, and soon enough formal decolonization of Burma in 48. So you can see where the fighting was what took place, and they were very much in the area of the Muslims of Arakan, or the Rohingya people, as we call them today. British sympathy, however, lay with the Muslims, who were described in War Office documents as, and I quote, much more hardworking and prolific than the Arakanese Buddhists. And some were, once again, I quote, great seamen, men at sea, whom, once again, I quote, manned about 20% of British merchant navy during the war, close quote. Now, the organization, training, and firepower that came with the Second World War fueled further conflict in Northern Arakan with formal decolonization of India and Burma. And the partition, the partition of British India into Hindu majority India and Muslim majority Pakistan. Pakistan itself had two separate territorial wings, as we know, until 1971, one in the northwest of the subcontinent and the other in eastern Bengal. Wartime ammunition dumps that were left behind by departing Allied and Japanese forces became a source of rearmament for both Muslims and Buddhist rebels in 1947, 1948. As Burma became independent from British colonial rule in January 1948, a large number of Muslim rebels, or mujahids as they call themselves, holy warriors, as we know what it means in Arabic, began fighting the British military. The mujahids, many of whom were ex-army men who had fought on the side of the Allied forces, attacked the flanks of regular troops of the Burmese military and then crossed the Naf River to find refuge in Teknaf, find refuge near Cox's Bazar. In retaliation, the Burmese government armed the Buddhists of Arakan against the Muslims. And thus one of the earliest blueprints of government support for violence against the Rohingya Muslims was crafted. And here I have a document in front of you where these instances of violence between the Muslims and the Buddhists and the role of the Burmese, recently independent Burmese state is underlined in this memo. Communist success in the Chinese Civil War in the north and the Malaya in the south temporarily transformed the Rohingya question into a Cold War concern for some British officials. How much did the Muslims of Arakan or the Mujahids actually align with the communists? Although there was some evidence that the Rohingya rebels were capturing armaments arriving from southern Burma and Malaya, and that were actually meant for communists, British officials acknowledged that the communist danger was exaggerated. What the Mujahids really wanted was autonomy. There was one group that wanted autonomy within Burma, and another group wanted to join the recently independent Pakistan because they felt as Muslims, they should be part of Pakistan and not Burma. With the 1947 partition of British India into India and Pakistan and the 1948 independence of Burma, the ethnic identity of Muslims of Arakan became the site of violent contestations by the Burmese state and a malleable tool for the Rohingyas themselves to express allegiance to the newborn nation states in their vicinity. Depending on whether the Rohingya group campaigned to join recently partitioned Muslim majority nation state of Pakistan, that is the Arakan Mujahid Party, which we were just talking about, the more violent group, or they desired autonomy within independent Burma, which was the Arakanese Muslim autonomy movement, they pushed for the Urdu language or the Burmese script for their own language. While the spoken form of the Rohingya language was similar, and it still remains similar to Chittagonian, which some would argue that is a language in its own right, as opposed to a dialect of Bengali. Chittagonian is very different from standard Bengali as is spoken in Dhaka and Calcutta. So we need to pay more attention to the multiple strategies of belonging that have been adopted historically by the Muslims of Arakan. At times they have pushed for the Urdu language when they were trying to reach out to Muhammad Ali Jinnah and to ensure that their townships of Mongdao and Wuchidang become part of recently decolonized Pakistan and become part of East Pakistan. When they were trying to just establish regional autonomy of their own in Burma, they highlighted their interest in adopting the Burmese script to write their own language. However, their language itself is very different from Burmese. There are Burmese words, undoubtedly, but Chittagonian and Rohingya languages, the two languages are mutually intelligible. And that is something that has to do with the history of these people and their common culture and heritage, and as a result, what that means for their language. The Bengali language movement in East Pakistan, which reached its peak with the violent police crackdown of activists in February 1952, made the Muslim Mujahids' affinity for joining Urdu-speaking Pakistan complicated and even traitorous. One of the earliest demands from 1948 of the separatist Mujahid Party was to declare Urdu the official language of the future Muslim majority Rohingya state or sub-state entity. The Rohingya struggled to preserve their identity in the backdrop of increasingly violent frontiers, ensured that their language script remained a motley of their efforts to seek recognition and refuge. The Perso-Arabic, the Burmese, the Urdu as the language, the Arabic-based Hanifi script, and today the Latin-based Rohingya Lish, which is basically Rohingya in English, Latin script. The Muslims of Arakan or the Rohingyas adopted multiple strategies of belonging along the lines of religion and language, but the state actors that they reached out to and appealed rejected their strategies on grounds of race. To the Burmese state, the Muslims of Arakan were not Burmese and could never racially be Burmese. They had to be the other, especially to draw the Arakanese Buddhists deep into the folds of a rather fraught Burmese national identity and Burmese nation building project. To Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who the Muslims of Arakan had appealed to in 1947, the Rohingyas were not to belong to Pakistan. They were different, a racial hierarchy that would re-emerge against the people of East Pakistan from the metropole of Karachi, Rawalpindi, and Islamabad. To East Pakistan and later Bangladesh, Chittagong and Arakan or Rakhine state remain incomprehensible. The incomprehensible troubled borderlands where people speak a strange language that can never belong to the core of Bengali language and culture as viewed from Dhaka. The layered otherization, the layered otherization of the Rohingya by the nation states on racial grounds is precisely through the strategies of belonging that they themselves had adopted by means of language and religion. These ambiguities of language, religion, and race and territoriality produced in their long cosmopolitan history, interrupted by the battlefields of the Second World War and reproduced in the precarious borderlands, continue to haunt their identity until this day, leading to the refugee crisis caused by the genocide that we have been encountering in our news feeds, especially before the pandemic, regularly. And here on the map, you can see the territory that we were discussing and where the most of the refugee camps are of the Rohingya people today. So with that, I end my presentation and I thank you very much for your attention.